but we clicked right away when we first met each other, because we discovered that, like a lot of people in the heritage conservation field, we had taken meandering paths to get where we were. So Frank has, worked as an architect and a museum director and a public historian, and has had a very rich and varied career. And he really brought all of those talents to Historic House Trust. And when he left Historic House Trust to become president of Old Salem in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, he had recently written a book called The Anarchist Guide to Historic House Museums. And it was, one of those great moments where you realize you've met somebody that you want to stay in touch with forever and ever. And it was an eye-opening experience, because what he really taught me during the time we worked together was that you don't want to treat these historic sites like they're fragile Fabergé eggs. You really want them to come to life. And I think what we're going to hear from Frank tonight is a fantastic journey of how you can make even sometimes the most stately house come to life. And one of the things that he's done in recent years is develop a program called One Night Stand, where he spends the night in a historic house museum. And that can sound terrifying to some people, but of course these were houses and people did live in them. And so we visit them today and we think, oh, don't touch anything, it's all very fragile. And we think of it as sort of almost, in some instances, kind of preserved in amber. And I think what Frank does, as he would say, is take that velvet rope away. But also, I think he gives us some insight into why have these houses endured and what are the interesting stories they tell. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank.
Thanks, Lisa. And thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to the foundation for allowing me to speak. And I think tonight, for me, is really special. And I hope that by the end of it, you will understand why. I will begin my talk with that. And can you see, Lisa? Everybody?
Yep, the screen is perfect. We can
Great,
see.
Thank you all so much. So even though I'm going to talk about a one-night stand, and the particular historic site is the Glessner House in Chicago, Illinois, I really take a kind of strange path to get where I'm going. And the name of this presentation is The Green Box. And I'll explain to you why that matters with this particular one-night stand. Before we go on, what I'd like to do is have everyone please right now for a minute, go and pick up an object of significance in your house and bring it next to you on your computer. So just go right now. I've given you a minute to find something that matters to you. Thank you all. We will return to those items later on in the talk. I would like to get started by just explaining a little bit of that crazy background that Lisa was alluding to. I am founder and president of Twisted Preservation Cultural Consulting. And in that, I really, with my team of researchers and other consultants, we get a chance to work with international museums and cultural heritage sites in dealing with smaller, more marginalized boutique narratives. And I will lecture and I do an interview process called the water cooler chats, where I talk about diversity and inclusion and equity. And so a lot of my thoughts about preservation and history sites are coming from the margins. I'm trained as an architect, both undergrad and master's program, and I really came into preservation and history site management through that process. So everything is new to me. I really don't know what I'm doing, so everything is a search. And you'll see that as we move along, that really is the way that I attack preservation and history sites. As part of Twisted Preservation, I have a series of blog posts, and as you can tell, these are just a few of the ones that I write about. And again, I try to talk about things that are not centered on what the dominant preservation narratives are, really talking about those gray, fuzzy areas of what history is, its relationship to nostalgia, and the types of things that are preserved and the types of things that are not preserved. One of the aspects of Twisted Preservation, and something that I did in New York City and in Philadelphia as well, I really pushed for us using history sites, and in particular house museums, in new and intriguing ways, so that we can teach history in ways that are much more present in our current culture. And that could range anywhere from video installations to site-specific dance, to entire cityscape poetry readings, like this Light on Sound we did in Flushing. And Lisa, of course, mentioned the Anarchist Guide to Historic House Museums. And Lisa, I think we may be well over 12 printings of the Anarchist Guide. It's one of those books that was really surprising, I think, to all of us, including Lisa. And so for me, it really came out of a frustration for someone who wasn't trained in preservation and history and cultural sites to have a difficult time understanding why people who loved these sites and why people who were spending their lives managing and taking care of these sites were making decisions that seemed to be counter to the very quality of why they wanted to maintain the site. And so this book really was an effort to document, make manifest the frustrations that I was feeling. Now, through all of this research between the work in Twisted Preservation and the Anarchist Guide book, I really have kind of learned a great deal about historic sites in the United States, particularly historic house museums. In this, and these are kind of king daddies of house museums that you all, I'm sure, are aware of, the underlined part is where I've always really concentrated. It wasn't when those houses were built or the significance that the historic interpretation tells you. I really became intrigued by when those buildings became historic sites. And because of that knowledge, I started to do a deeper level of research. Who were the organizations that restored these house museums and these historic sites? And I'm really just showing you three of them here. The Colonial Dames of America, established in 1890, the National Society of Colonial Dames of America, 91, and the Daughters of the American Revolution, 1890. Clearly something was going on in 1890 and 1891. These three organizations really should be proud of the work that they did. Most of the historic house museums and sites that we have some relationship to these three organizations, and certainly members of these organizations. But please remember these dates and the dates from the previous slide, because when you start to look at what's happening culturally, and Wallace Nutting is just one of the interesting figures. Wallace Nutting was a minister, but he was also a photographer. And oh, by the way, he also made reproduction colonial furniture. He also purchased and restored, and I put that in quotations, a bunch of New England houses. And those New England houses were used as retail centers for his reproduction furniture and photographs. The houses also served as backdrops for his photographs. And in the upper right, I've circled in orange, this is just an advertisement about how the photographs that Wallace Nutting took in his quasi-historic homes filled with reproduction colonial furniture were used. And they were really used in fully nostalgic ways, embracing a colonialism that really was about commodification. You could go into any of these houses and you could pick up a chair and take it home. I mean, these were the IKEAs of the period. And so early on, historic house museums took on this kind of economic, but also nostalgic quality that really, quite frankly, they've never washed off. And so when we look at these sites now, we tend to think of them as absolutely authentic identities and entities, when in fact, they really stem from these periods of commodification and economics. And really, when you start to look at larger sites, and on the left, I'm showing you Colonial Williamsburg, which I think we all know was Williamsburg. And Rockefeller and his crew came in and purchased a good portion of the town. And in order for them to reproduce Colonial Williamsburg, they actually had to demolish more of the town than they rebuilt. And in fact, a good portion of Colonial Williamsburg, although it is tied to archaeological and historic documentation, are reproductions. And I'm showing you here the governor's palace, which was reconstructed. And the picture above is the high school that they demolished so that they could make way for the green space in front of the governor's palace. And if any of you have been to Detroit and visited Greenfield Village, Henry Ford's kind of typical American village, you really get a sense that he moved everything here from all over the country and curated an experience of American exceptionalism and curated out any of the difficult narratives that many of us have been witnessing in the past year. So when you go to Ford Village, you have this sense of nostalgia, which is tied directly back to those conversations about Wallace Nutting and the colonial dames. It's just done on such a large scale that it's now environmental. It's at a village scale, and Old Salem is an example of that, although to less degree than Colonial Williamsburg and Greenfield Village, because most of Old Salem is original, even though they tore down probably 2/3 of the city around it so that they could keep it. Now, part of my research has been to really look at historic house museums and history sites and the years that they became those sites. And in this, I'm showing you it overlapped with a bit of research called human cycles. It's history as it's related to science. And I'm showing you here, the blue lines are racially motivated violence. The darker blue are politically motivated violence. And you see the legend to the right. What I've done is I've superimposed on top of that the periods that house museums and history sites were started. Not when the buildings were built, but when the buildings were saved and preserved. One thing that you should see very clearly is that many of the history sites were produced during periods of extreme violence, racial, political, labor. And if you look at the very bottom, also immigration. And so these issues of strong immigration protests and backlash pushed for a kind of Americanization of culture, what it meant to be American. And so many of these, and I use the 1890s as an example with the colonial dames, Many of these are tied directly to intense periods of immigration and intense periods of violence toward immigrants. And so these sites, although nostalgic and forms of commodification, were also forms of a kind of nostalgic politics about what it meant to be American, so that the immigrants could go and see that building and learn what it meant. Now, as Lisa mentioned, one of the things I do with Twisted Preservation is I'm really lucky enough to be invited to travel the world, and I'm showing you a map on the upper left, traveling the world and sleeping in house museums and using what we consider collections items. Sleeping on Lincoln's bed, using the tea set at the Glessner House, using Eschrik's actual art furniture in his bedroom, and sleeping on the sleeping porch of the Green and Green bungalow in Pasadena. So all of these things really start to inform the way that I understand history sites. And what I want to talk about tonight specifically is one of those one-night stands, and that's the Glessner House in Chicago. This is if you don't know it, it's a ponderous, heavy stone fortress of a building. I'm showing you 3 pictures of the street level facade. And at the very bottom on the right, I'm showing you the floor plan of the house, the first level floor plan. It's on a corner, so both sides, the left and the bottom, are streets. So this thing maintains that corner with that kind of stone facade. In the middle row, I'm showing you the front facade, still very somber. You enter into that house, and what you are greeted with is this incredibly beautiful, soft, luxurious, Gilded Age / arts and crafts Romanesque interior. It is just an extraordinary building with extraordinary artifacts throughout. Now, when I stayed there for this one-night stand, and I tell you that every single object was beautiful, every surface, piece of furniture, every piece of tile, the wall surfaces, the woodworking, everything. It was like a wedding banquet. It was overload. It was just incredibly luxurious. Now, I just want to remind you what that exterior facade was. And you very clearly got a sense that this house was about somehow keeping the outside out and maintaining the interior space as something special and unique. It was truly a womb-like space. Well, I'm showing you now the bedroom that I slept in. This was the guest bedroom. And the bottom picture is the morning after me sleeping in that bedroom. I'm not really concentrating on the Glessner House itself, even though, as you can tell, I wrote a blog post, and you can go on Twisted Preservation and read it. I'm writing the blog post as I'm looking out that window. What I really am interested in this conversation is, in the morning, in making coffee, I left those luxurious rooms and I started to enter into the servants' wing. The first picture is from the dining room, and then you walk through the anteroom and you get to the kitchen. You walk through the kitchen, and there's, tucked in the back corner of the house, this little room with a table, and you look out the window. And in fact, this was so inviting that that's where I sat, and there's my cup of coffee. And I looked out into this cloistered space, this cloistered garden space. Because remember, the exterior is this castle and the inside is this very soft, porous feeling. Well, the reason why this became so important, and I didn't realize it at the time, was while I was sitting there drinking my coffee, the executive director came in asking me if I wanted some more coffee. And he started to explain to me how excited they were because they had just found out that the brick and tile work were made in Zanesville, Ohio. And this is interesting because Glessner, the owner of the house, was born in Zanesville, and we're still investigating it. Well, as I was surrounded by all of this tile and now finding out that it was made in Zanesville, something clicked, and I knew a little bit about this region of Ohio, and I started to ask him more and more questions. And I'm just showing you in the red dot in the middle of Ohio, Zanesville, and this area of Ohio is known as the Clay Belt. It's the reason why so much American tile and brickwork at the period came out of Ohio. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that and why that matters in this discussion. I need to pause for a moment because when he told me that the tile work came from Zanesville, there was a moment in my mind that I was taken out of where I thought. I was in the Glessner House, I was in the Gilded Age, and I was studying and researching the Glessners and that house. But what it did is it pulled me out of that particular time period, and it pulled me out of that particular place. So I'll need everybody to take a deep breath, shake their head a bit. And now, as I'm sitting in that tiled room in the very back of the Glessner kitchen, I'm going to take you to a different place. So I'm going to take you to something that is very personal and the reason for the talk this evening. My family, both sides of my family, one from Rome and one from Palermo, immigrated in the early 1900s and ended up in an extraordinarily small town called Shawnee, Ohio. Now, my family never talked much about our immigration, nor did they ever tell me why we ended up in Shawnee, Ohio. And pictures of Shawnee, Ohio, and I'm showing you on the left in the middle row, that is downtown Shawnee. On the right, I'm showing you Palermo. And so one side of my family immigrated from Palermo and went to Shawnee. And then, of course, like many of us on this call, they traveled by boat to get to the United States. And then once they arrived, they took the train. And it seemed odd to me that you would take a train from the East Coast out to Shawnee, Ohio. Well, I really didn't know that much about Shawnee because my family didn't talk about it. I didn't really know much about my great-grandparents because they didn't talk about it. I'm showing you here an aerial photograph of Shawnee, Ohio. This is Shawnee right here. In investigating, after going to the Glessner House and looking to the Zanesville area, I realized that Shawnee was less than 30 minutes away from Zanesville. And in getting oral histories from my family, I realized that my great-grandfather worked in a brick and tile factory in Shawnee, Ohio, in the Clay Belt. This is Claycraft, which is the name of the factory. My family immigrated directly into an area of Shawnee called Italyville. And I'm showing you here this red line. This red line, it's the city limits of Shawnee. It was dictated that Italian immigrants could only live outside of the city limits and live in Italyville. I'm showing you here a photograph, which is the only photograph I have of the family at that time. My grandfather who every day his entire life, once he moved to Shawnee, walked from his house in Italyville on the railroad tracks, and I'm showing you down here on the bottom, avoiding up here on the top, walking through downtown, walking to the clay craft, tile, and brick site, and walking home. And in fact, my mother tells a story of her grandfather always carrying a black lunchbox. His wife never learned English, so he would take notes every day at the clay craft factory. And when he came home over dinner, my grandmother said that he would speak to her in English and Italian and explain what happened during the day. It was her only Italian conversation at the time. This was his existence. I also found out after the Glessner House one night stand that the reason why he walked on the railroad tracks is because of the discrimination that the Italian immigrants felt that they couldn't walk through downtown. So he had to walk to and from via the railroad tracks. We did not have a picture of the house that they lived in. And this is the only photograph that I was able to get in my research. As you can tell, the house was not preserved. It is now just a mess. It's just a heap. And so it became really important to me to understand this level of bigotry against Italians during this time. And this is from a newspaper editorial from the same area of the clay belt in Ohio. The experiment of importing them, the Italian immigrants, into the Hocking Valley will prove a costly one. As a rule, Italian laborers are ignorant and vicious. They know nothing of our language and seem to be incapable of learning it. Very few of them know enough to read and write their own language. Now, of course, this is just one editorial of many. I also investigated Chicago at the time, and there were several articles. One in particular stood out that said that Sicilians, and mind you, I'm Sicilian, that Sicilians were only good for cleaning up horse debris on the streets. And I found this photograph of an Italian immigrant as a street cleaner. At the top, I'm showing you a photograph of Italian immigrant clay and brick workers at the clay craft factory. Again, seeing the larger picture of what it meant to buy bricks and tile from the clay belt in Ohio. After doing this research, I contacted the Glessner House and I said, could you please do some investigating? Can you tell me about the servants in the houses? And so they did. They sent me back a long spreadsheet. Around 40 years worth of notations by Mrs. Glessner. She noted everything about each servant. From 1888 to 1928, and I'm showing you one of the books. Out of 40 years of servants, 157 servants, not a single one was of Italian descent. There wasn't a single name of Italian descent. In fact, most of them were Irish. There was one name that seemed out of place. They investigated it, and it was Lithuanian. And so what this did do to me was not only become interested in the servants at the Glessner House, but particularly the Italian immigrants who weren't allowed inside of the Glessner House. Now, this was really strongly felt by me because here I am, Sicilian Italian immigrant family, sleeping in their guest bedroom, having free reign of the Glessner House and writing about it on my blog. And in investigating, and I think you probably have seen these two famous photographs, this is the floor plan again of the Glessner House. The red is the main house. This is where I slept. This was for 3 people. This entire half of the house, all of the floors were for servants. They had at sometimes 10 servants to serve these 3 or 4 people. And it was interesting to me to make the direct comparison between a tenement at the time that could hold probably 10 to 12 people. And these are at generally the same scale. So as luxurious as that house was, and as spacious as I felt, mind you, this is the stair hall in the Glessner House. The stair hall is right here. You can get a sense of the scale of one immigrant's house. Well, now we're out of time and out of place again, because as I'm writing the Glessner One Night Stand article, my uncle passes away, and I unexpectedly get this green metal box delivered to me. And in this green metal box are photographs of my family and paraphernalia from my family. And I'm right now just giving you a list of the contents of what was inside of this green box. It ranged anywhere from pictures of my grandparents to houses they lived in, my grandfather's retirement card, picture of me at graduation, a tape from my grandfather read something that he wrote to all of us about being a salesman. And in the box was this picture of a house. What I realized was my uncle had sent me the only picture of the house in Shawnee, Ohio, the Guzzos House that they lived their entire life in the United States. Remember, this is all that's left of this house, and this is the image of this house. Also in this green box were handwritten notes. I didn't understand what they were. It's a script, a reading script from my grandfather to his boss at the end of his life. My grandfather was a tomb headstone layer in the cemetery. And he pulled something in his body and he was unable to work. And he was asking his boss if he could please just get his last check. And he kept rewriting this over and over again until he would call his boss. And then he noted when he actually called him. His boss said no, that when he came back to work, he would get his last check. And so I was told that my grandfather, who's right here, did not receive his last check. And so bias and labor issues against Italians continued even until when my grandfather was 70 years old. And having this level of documentation about his struggle of a labor issue was pretty amazing. And then that kind of odd picture of me right before my graduation, it seemed odd. And then I started to look at what was behind me. And I realized this plate, this sculpture, there's a painting on the wall. You probably can't see behind me. But as I was sitting there looking at this photograph, I realized that I had kept these objects. Here I am, 56 years old, and I had kept these objects. They're on my mantle in my office. And so these artifacts helped define who I am. And I kept them. They had great meaning for me, and they still do. And here it is as an 18-year-old in my bedroom. And for some reason, it became a part of the contents of that green box. And what it did is it really pushed me to actually document that mantle in that moment. I photographed it, And then I wrote down everything and where I got it on another document. And it really became a public history issue for me. Why were the Glessner objects so much more important than my objects? Why was the Glessner house preserved and not my great-grandparents' house preserved? I also started labeling all of these objects because it seemed to me that if we don't provide narrative, that no one can appreciate them at the same level. Why are they on my mantle? And then as I started, as any good historian would do, I started to organize pictures and I started to look. And as an architect, I started to be interested in the buildings that they lived in, how it defined their being. Oddly enough, I found a picture of this house, which is the house I grew up in, and that is looking out of that window. And then I want to return to this bit of research. So we have the cycles of violence in the graph. I added when historic house museums and sites were started. And now I have my own. I've added my family. I've added the contents of the green box. And it was startling to me. Look where that orange line is. Look at where these Italian immigrants stepped into in the United States. And it occurred to me, all of those photographs and objects in that green box had a quality about them that spoke about issues of immigration, migration, politics, xenophobia, racism, redlining, family systems, nationalism, bias, preservation, racism, labor laws, human rights, healthcare issues, queer, LGBTQ. I'm a member of the queer community. All of these issues were found in that tiny little green box. And for me, the Glessner House took on a much greater level of meaning because I was allowed to bring my personal family history. And in this case, I'm sharing with you the contents of the green box, sharing with you what this meant to me. So the Glessner House is not really about a Gilded Age wealthy family who built this house. For me, as a descendant of an Italian immigrant who faced extreme bias and racism, that house stood for other things. And we're in the middle of a situation now with historic houses and sites where we have the possibility that we can speak to people like me with sites like that.
Funeral for a home will commemorate the lives and the stories that homes contain. Think of your home. Think of your house, the stories that are told. This memorial homegoing service will coincide with the building demolition as an opportunity to celebrate the lives of the homes that this home has touched.
When you think back perhaps to the house you grew up in, or a bedroom that was really important to you, there is an emotional tie to that place and to those four walls. And I feel that most people have cared at one point or another for those places that they've lived. Funeral for a Home is an opportunity as both an art project as well as a public history project to reflect on the meaning of our housing stock here in Philadelphia.
Try to think about it as if this is the last year of this home's life. And so this is an opportunity to commemorate the stories and the families that lived in that home, and to give it a proper memorial service.
We are here to remember the past. We are here to reflect on the present. We are here to look for the future.
And then with that object that I asked you to get, you know, my grandfather asks in this tape, have you ever thought of it in this light? And he goes through these points about thinking more deeply about things. And just based on my green box, I can no longer look at artifacts in the Historic House Museum or even artifacts on my own mantle, or the artifacts that are sitting in front of you right now, without asking myself how many lives have been affected by that object. If it was placed in a museum, what information would you really feel necessary for others to understand it? And then if you were really to be self-reflective, how did that object represent bias or racism? Who made it? How were they paid? How did you get it? There's so many layers that we don't ask ourselves about house museums and history sites that really could propel these sites into the future and become even more significant components to real life issues and policy making and understanding. Thank you again, Lisa, for asking me to present. I really do appreciate it.
Well, that's great. Frank, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen.
Got it.
We've got 7 or 8 minutes before we have to say goodbye to everybody. And, there's a reason we're friends, because when I teach my class at Pratt, one of the first assignments I do is say to the students, take something that you own that you think is heritage and tell me why, because all of these things have layers of meaning. Something can have great personal value or it can have significance. And I think one question I would add to the list of, when you're looking at an artifact, not only how did you get it and who made it, but, since many of us on this call tonight, are the children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren of immigrants, I think one of the really fascinating things is, what are the objects that have carried generation to generation, and in some instances came with the person, and it can seem so mundane, but why did that person feel that was what they wanted to bring with them to their new life, across an ocean to a lot of uncertainty. I think the other thing that's fascinating about your talk tonight is, again, many of us are from the New York metro area, so we know about Italian immigration here. We often don't think about what happened to Italian immigrants in other parts of the country, because not that we didn't know there were immigrants in other parts of the country, but you tend to think of it so heavily in the Northeast that you forget that there were Italian immigrants all across the country, and everybody may have had variations on a theme, but everybody had vastly different experiences living, in an urban area versus living in, more rural areas in the center of the country.
And based on my research, it did start to make sense how my family obviously ended up in Shawnee, Ohio, that there really was marketing by the Claycraft Manufacturing Company to get cheap labor. So in New York or in Philadelphia or in Baltimore, pay for the train trip out to Shawnee and then put them in Italyville. So there was a real conscious effort to move families and individuals into places where they were manufacturing things.
So we have some questions for the audience, and I'm going to start with Joe Shelsa, who I think had his hand up a moment ago.
Yes, I did. Well, Franklin and Lisa. Lisa, first of all, thank you for inviting Franklin. Of course, I found this very interesting.
Great.
Franklin doesn't know who I am, so I'm going to tell him.
Absolutely.
Franklin, I'm president of the Italian American Museum in New York City, on the corner of Grand and Mulberry Street. Look us up later on. We're under redevelopment. I'd love to have you come and present at the museum at some other point. I really found the presentation fascinating, very interesting way to look at it. I would like to know if you have any more information about the discrimination that they experienced. Was it actually de jure? Was it written, or was just known that they were moving to those areas? I mean, that's important to know.
Yeah, I was dealing with the Shawnee historian who has since passed away, and he said that he hadn't been able to find anything formal, but it was very common knowledge and people spoke it verbally. And it was literally called Italyville, and that they couldn't live inside the city limits. I failed to tell you that my great grandfather, walking back and forth from work, he died on the railroad tracks.
Oh, wow.
So this manifestation of bias, it lasted through his entire life. And in fact, that black lunchbox is really important because the family went back to get it because it had the little notepad that he would read to my great grandmother, and it was gone. So there's just lots about missing narratives here, which makes it even more sad.
I'm not going to monopolize all your time. I'll try to get Lisa to give me your information and talk to you more later. But just one more thing I'd like to say. It's extremely important that third and fourth generation Americans of Italian descent know about the discrimination that was experienced, because they really don't. Because what's happened as a result of being quiet about our struggles, nobody knows about it. And I think it's important, not because it's for us, but that they should know that they went through similar types of experiences as other people have gone through and continue to go through today.
And it also did seem very odd to me that my family just didn't talk much about it. They never discussed how they ended up in Shawnee, Ohio. And obviously they didn't want to be known as Italian immigrants. They just wanted to be American, but they just didn't talk about it. There is this real lack of immigrant family history. I personally felt, and Lisa was kind enough to help me with an application for the Rome Prize, and a big part of that was to somehow relate this black hole of before immigration to Shawnee, Ohio, because my life in my family really started at Shawnee, Ohio.
Last thing, my son's an architect also, went to Carnegie Mellon and Harvard, and he won the Rome Prize also. So he was there.
Oh, I didn't win it.
No, not you will, I'm sure.
Yes, that's right. You didn't win it yet.
Yeah. All right, that's enough out of me.
So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Great.
Thank
Well,
you.
before we sign off, are there any questions or comments from anybody else in the audience? You can unmute yourself and ask a question or write into the chat.
Tony?
Yeah, I had a question, and I apologize if it's a little offbeat. But I was wondering, as you stayed overnight in these historic houses, which, you know, is a unique experience, I think. Did you experience anything unusual in these historic houses?
No, that's not a strange question at all. I get that asked a lot. I don't. It's not as though I don't believe in kind of marginal stuff. I just never experienced it. The only time I ever felt anything uncomfortable, I was staying in a plantation house, and I knew that I was going to write about the enslaved at the plantation house. And that evening, there were several shutters slammed on the house, and I promptly took a sleeping pill and went to bed.
Well, I think on that note, we don't have any other questions. I'm going to say, Frank, we definitely want you to come back, and because there's much more you can tell us. And it's, you know, as always, great fun to spend time with you. And I'm going to just thank you from the bottom of my heart to taking time to being with us this evening. And if you have any final words.
No. Thank you. And Lisa, I love you, and anything for you. I love working with you. So I'm very happy to participate in anything you ask me to do.
Great. Well, I hope we'll see you in person in New York before too long. And with that, I'm going to thank everybody for being with us and wish everybody a good evening.
Thank you so much. And Lisa, you can share my
Absolutely. I'll put you two in touch via email.
Thank you, everybody. Please be safe.
Thank you.